We had to start this war, you just said, 60 days ago, because the nuclear weapon was an imminent threat. Now you're saying that it was completely obliterated?
They had not given up their nuclear ambitions, and they had a conventional shield of thousands of
So
missiles.
Operation Midnight Hammer accomplished nothing of substance. It left us at exactly the same place we...
On the 29th of April, 2026, Pete Hegseth sat at the witness table in a packed House Armed Services Committee room. Cameras flashed. The tension was immediate. Adam Smith, the ranking Democrat from Washington State, looked down at his notes, paused for several seconds, then delivered a question that struck at the heart of the administration's entire justification for the Iran war. Mr. Secretary, last year, you and the president told the American people that Iran's nuclear facilities had been completely and utterly destroyed in Operation Midnight Hammer. So why exactly did this administration launch a full-scale war 8 months later, citing an imminent nuclear threat as a central reason? The room fell silent. Hegseth shifted in his seat, adjusted his microphone slightly, and looked directly at Smith. Smith did not raise his voice. He simply waited, letting the question hang in the air. That silence stretched longer than most expected. It was the kind of pause that makes everyone in the room lean forward. That 4-minute exchange has now been viewed millions of times across platforms, and for good reason. It exposed a core contradiction that the administration had not been forced to address publicly until that exact moment. Today, I'm walking you through the full context, the exchange itself, and the escalating evidence that made Hegseth's position increasingly difficult to defend. Let's go back to the foundation of this story. In June 2025, the United States executed Operation Midnight Hammer. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, supported by over 100 escort and refueling aircraft, struck Iran's most hardened nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. The weapons included 14 GBU, 5.7 massive ordnance penetrators, each one a 13.6-ton bunker-busting bomb specifically designed to reach targets buried up to 200 feet underground. These are among the most powerful non-nuclear munitions in the American arsenal. President Trump addressed the nation shortly afterward and declared the sites completely and utterly destroyed. Secretary Hegseth used nearly identical language in multiple interviews and briefings in the following weeks. The message was clear and repeated. The Iranian nuclear threat had been eliminated as a serious near-term danger. Fast forward to the 28th of February 2026, the United States initiated major combat operations against Iran. Among the primary justifications presented to the public and to Congress was the urgent need to prevent Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. By April 29th, exactly 60 days into the conflict, the human and financial toll had become impossible to ignore. 13 American service members killed in action, over 400 wounded, more than $25 billion expended. Global oil prices had spiked to 4-year highs, with US gasoline prices following sharply upward. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply normally passes, remained severely restricted. This was the backdrop when Pete Hegseth finally appeared before the House Armed Services Committee. Notably, the Republican-led committee had scheduled no formal oversight hearings during the first 6 weeks of active combat operations. Adam Smith, who has served on this committee continuously since 1997, had been pressing for that opportunity. Smith is not a flashy speaker. He is methodical. He builds arguments using the administration's own public statements, intelligence reports, and timelines. Hegseth, a combat veteran and former television host, was now in a very different environment, one where every word carried legal and political weight. Smith opened by reminding the committee that every previous president, including Donald Trump during his first term, had successfully prevented Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon without resorting to direct, large-scale war on Iranian territory. He then turned to the present situation. Since this war started, Iran's nuclear program has not been weakened in any meaningful, measurable way. In current negotiations, Iran's position is essentially that the United States should pay them to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That position is completely untenable. The strait was open and functioning before this war began. Now we find ourselves negotiating to return to the pre-war status quo. So my question, Mr. Secretary, is this. What is the actual plan? How does this lethal kinetic action translate into a genuine, lasting improvement in the nuclear situation? Walk us through the sequence. How does this end with a better outcome? Hegseth leaned forward and began his response. I would take issue with the premise of the question that nothing was accomplished. Operation Midnight Hammer was a very effective strike. Smith interrupted, calmly but firmly. I did not say nothing was done. I said that in this war, under this administration. Hegseth continued, pivoting to criticism of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, arguing that it had provided Iran with resources to fund proxy groups across the region and advance its capabilities. He emphasized that the current administration would not repeat those mistakes, and that President Trump had chosen direct confrontation instead of diplomacy that he believed had repeatedly failed. Smith pressed again. So they have not broken yet. We have not reached that point after 60 days of combat. Hegseth replied that Iran's underground nuclear facilities had been obliterated and that American and Israeli intelligence were now monitoring every movement 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He added that Iran still possessed nuclear ambitions and had used conventional missile forces as a protective shield. Smith's next line raised the tension noticeably. 60 days ago, this administration told us we had to begin this war because a nuclear weapon was imminent. Now you are telling us those same facilities were already completely obliterated. Which is it? Hegseth paused. He adjusted his notes. The silence in the hearing room was audible. When he answered, he returned to the idea that Iran's broader conventional capabilities had to be addressed to prevent a slow walk toward a weapon, drawing a comparison to North Korea's strategy. But Smith kept returning to the central timeline. If the facilities were truly obliterated in 2025, why was the same threat presented as urgent enough to justify war in 2026? If the facilities had not been obliterated, then the public messaging in 2025 had significantly overstated the results. There was no comfortable third path. The pressure mounted as Smith referenced the U.S. intelligence community's own 2025 Worldwide Threat Assessment. That unclassified document, delivered to Congress, stated that Iran was not conducting an active, ordered nuclear weapons program and had not restarted the structured effort suspended in 2003. Yet 8 months later, the administration presented the threat as immediate and severe enough to warrant major military action. No detailed public intelligence update had explained that shift. Official language had also changed quietly. By late 2025, internal and public statements moved from completely obliterated to significantly degraded. No formal correction or press conference accompanied that shift. Each layer of detail Smith introduced made the original claims harder to reconcile with the decision to go to war. By this stage of the exchange, Hegseth's answers had become noticeably shorter and more repetitive. His body language showed visible discomfort, tightened jaw, frequent small shifts in his chair. When Smith asked once more for concrete benchmarks and an exit pathway, Hegseth replied, "You're missing the point." That phrase landed with force. It was not a detailed strategic explanation. It was not new intelligence. It was not a description of measurable progress. It was a deflection. The Secretary of Defense, when confronted with his own administration's prior statements, offered no detailed timeline for denuclearization, no updated damage assessment, and no clear metrics for victory. The hearing took place on the final day of the 60-day War Powers Resolution clock. The next day, April 30th, the administration sent a letter to Congress asserting that hostile actions had ceased, even while the U.S. Navy continued active enforcement of a blockade around Iranian ports. Multiple legal experts, including scholars who served in previous Republican administrations, have called this interpretation of the War Powers Resolution highly questionable and difficult to defend. The economic consequences continue to mount. Goldman Sachs and other analysts reported Iranian oil exports had fallen to roughly 4% of pre-war levels. American families are paying noticeably higher prices at the pump and in grocery stores. Inflation pressures that the administration had promised to reduce are moving in the opposite direction. 13 American families have lost loved ones in a conflict that was presented in part as necessary to neutralize a nuclear threat that the administration had previously claimed was already destroyed. This single confrontation did not end the military campaign, but it placed on the public record a direct, unscripted challenge to the consistency of the administration's case for war. It demonstrated a veteran lawmaker using only official statements and timelines to create a logical trap that the witness could not easily escape. The questions that remain are serious. What was the actual assessed damage from the 2025 strikes, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency's internal July 2025 report? Why was the language quietly softened without public acknowledgement? What specific new intelligence justified shifting from destroyed to imminent threat in under a year? And perhaps most importantly, what measurable conditions would allow this conflict to end without further escalation or open-ended commitment? If you're watching this because these costs, whether in lives, dollars, or higher gas prices concern you, drop a comment below with the single fact from this hearing that stands out most to you. Was it the timeline contradiction, the economic impact, or the war powers questions? I read every comment. The American people still deserve clear, consistent answers, grounded in verifiable outcomes rather than repeated deflections. Oversight is not opposition. It is a constitutional responsibility. On the 29th of April, 2026, that responsibility produced one of the most revealing moments of this conflict so far. If this detailed breakdown helped you understand the significance of what happened in that committee room, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates as more testimony, documents, or developments emerge from this story. Because the record is now clear, the questions are on the table, and the American public is still waiting for answers that match the scale of the sacrifices being asked.